Welcome back, everyone. We are back here with another episode of the R2 Cents podcast. My name is Aaron, and this is my wife, Asia, the host of the show. And this is a special week for us. We have our first guest, and our first guest happens to be a very important person to both of us, somebody that I lived with for a couple of years, and I regard as a very, very, very wise man. So this is Dr. Mark Guadagnoli. Mark, how are you?
Thanks, Aaron and Asia. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm excited about being here with you guys.
Yeah, we're excited too.
We've been looking forward to this one ever since you gave us the go ahead. So,
hmm hmm
all
Yeah.
right. So, today we're talking about personal growth, and you happen to be in the life coaching space as well, Mark. So, I just kind of wanted to get your take before we dive into it. Like, what are these concepts to you? Like, what to you, what does personal growth mean? What does it encompass?
Hmm.
And then maybe if life coaching you feel is different in a way, or if it's the same thing, what does that kind of mean to you?
It's actually a really interesting question. I just had this conversation the other day with someone who said he's been getting pinged lately because people want to be a life coach for him, and he was asking, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I don't actually know what that means." Like, you know, because I think it's so there is not a one size fits all situation, right? I mean, there are certain things that I think are foundational to anyone. Um, and if those things don't exist, that they need to be created. Like, for example, understanding who you really are and what you stand for. Like, you know, uh, you, since we know each other, values are a huge deal to me, right? But not values like intellectual values. Like, what is it that you comes from your heart, right? That truly represents the person. I'll tell you, one of my favorite quotes that just I come back to this over and over and over again, that I think probably encapsulates personal growth, life coach, whatever, whatever you want to call it, right? Somebody who helps you to be more of you. It's the You may know this story already. Michelangelo was asked one time, like, if you or your listeners, I think you guys have both seen Michelangelo's statues, but if you've never seen David, which is this 18-foot unbelievable carving in granite, one of the hardest stones there is, and you look at his hands, and they look like real hands. You can see the veins in them and everything. Anyway, Michelangelo was asked, how do you do this? Like, how do you know how to carve and so forth? And he said, when I look at the stone, I see an angel trapped inside, and my job is just to remove the excess stone to set it free, right? And I think that, to me, that's what this coaching is all about, right? It's not that you change people, that you reinvent. You just set free who they are in their best version of themselves. And because I think anything else is inauthentic. And for most of us, our best version is something we'd be proud of.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting way to put it. I don't know that I've ever heard you say that because my initial thought when you were explaining that is y- most people, myself included, would be I'm trying to change myself into something else. The reason I'm doing all of these things is to change who I am, whether that's physically, mentally, fundamentally, even to something else rather than it's already there. I need to just like uncover it. That's a really interesting, like, perspective sort of shifting idea.
I agree. I actually have heard that story before, but not used in that way of like, this is what you believe, pardon me, like personal growth is like finding what's already inside of you. So I kind of have like a follow-up question based off of that because you obviously work with a lot of people. So is there like, where do we lose that along the way? like that, because I feel like even too, like right now we're in this season of having like young kids and just like seeing them be so authentic to who they are because no one has diminished that yet, right? And so I'm curious, like in your experience, where you find that gets lost for people.
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I answer that, I have one. Aaron, are we supposed to bring beer to this?
It looks like beer, but it's actually not. We could do that another time, though. Happy to do that.
Yeah, Asia, it's a great question because if what we're doing is removing the excess stone, how did that excess stone get there in the first place?
Yeah.
Right. And there are so many different ways that it gets there. But, one of the things that I think is fundamental to human beings is that we are adaptable. Um, which sounds like it's a good thing, and mostly it is. But when we're young, very young, like for example, the age of your two boys, um, what we're learning is how to be successful and safe within the world that we're growing up in, right? And what that world really means is, for the most part, your household. And so if you have, for example, a narcissistic parent, then maybe being safe means being a pleaser for other people, right? Because you need to be a pleaser to that narcissistic parent so that you don't get in trouble and you get rewarded for that. But but if you have a parent who is provides safety for you and then lets you experiment, like I've seen you with the boys. I mean, I think you guys do a great job. But if you have that kind of a situation, then they don't have to create something that is in the short run helpful for them to be safe, but in the long run becomes highly maladaptive. The narcissist situation is one that you have to peel away that stone because they've been putting it on themselves so long that they don't even know it's there anymore. And the thing about it is most of us set that in in stone, so to speak, when we're 5, 6, 7 years old, and that's our operating system, and we continue to operate with that system for the rest of our lives unless something changes. And that's why you get in the same relationships and and the same, bad habits and the same this and that because you're using an operating system that worked at one point and now it doesn't work.
What? Okay, that I think that was a really tangible thing. Someone could be like, "Oh, okay, that's why I do that." If they have a narcissistic parent or something around them. Do you have any other examples of?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so you hear this middle child syndrome, right? Middle child syndrome feels like they're lost and they're in between, and they either become rebellious or they become great negotiators or those kinds of things. There's nothing wrong in that situation. That just happens to be where you're born, right? Um, the youngest child, a lot of times, and you guys have already started to see this, the youngest child seems a lot of times more daring, um, more self-sufficient, more, a lot of these kinds of things. And it's not like all of a sudden you get the next level genetics and that happens. No, it's usually because they're parented less. Because you're not so freaked out about the first child, like, oh my God, how do we raise a child? Right. And
Yeah.
so now I say that, but I will also say, I mean, both of you know Max and Allie, my two kids, they're completely different.
Yeah.
And for the most part, I raised them as close as I could together. So there is definitely a genetic component to this. There's some really interesting research on. You've probably heard of the Minnesota Twins studies, where they had all these identical twins that were separated at birth and went to orphanages. And then years later, they looked at these twins and saw what was in common with them and what was different, with the idea that what was in common, because they grew up completely different, was genetics, and what was different was nurture, right? And they found some really fascinating things. Like, for example, the incidence of schizophrenia seems to be, it was one of the early clues that it happened to be more likely genetics, right? Um, but but things like drive and ambition seem to have a lot to do with genetics. And so you would see certain things like, for example, the kids may have been very different when they were young as far as school was concerned, but as they get older, they get more similar. And so, so anyway, the point is that genetics play a really big role, but we can't do anything about that, right? What you can do stuff about is the environment and the nurture and those types of things. But, and so I'll tell you what, so this gets back to this question of life coaching or, optimization. Like, I like to think about it as optimization. I do not think about it as how can you be the best. I think about it as how can you be your best, right? Whatever that happens to be. And for some people, your best is the best, but for everybody, your best is your best, right? And so how do you do that? And this is why it's a one size fits all. Even if you come from the same genetic pool, raised in the same household, et cetera, you're not the same, right? So there are 8 kids in my family, and if I were going to life coach those 8 people, every one of them would be different in the things we talk about. The foundation would be the same. What are your values? What do you stand for? What's important to you? These kinds of things. But then it's a crapshoot, right? They have different goals. They have different ways of communicating with themselves, which is really important, and with the world around them, et cetera, right? And so the idea that there is a formulaic way to help people to be their best, I think that there are guidelines, but I don't think it's a cookie cutter situation.
So speaking of guidelines, then, um, what do you think are your like fundamental pieces around helping somebody? Like I know obviously values are a huge one to you. I'm not sure how many people even know what that is, so maybe you could talk about that and how that is affecting you going forward and why. I know another big one for you is just being gracious, having gratitude for things in life. So maybe you could uh, pin down a few of those for you and just explain what they are and why it matters to somebody going forward in life. If you really are trying to peel back these layers of granite and get to maybe that optimized you.
Yeah, Aaron, gratitude is it's not a one size fits all situation like I talked about, but gratitude and being present in the moment and these things, there are a few fundamental things that can shift your world, and you're in complete control of that. So, uh, Viktor Frankl, who wrote the classic, wonderful, and
Tell me back there.
right, yeah, I mean, Man's Search for Meaning. Here's a guy in Auschwitz, and he somehow found meaning within that environment. Like, that's crazy to me.
Yeah, it
And,
is.
and so many of us have such a hard time finding meaning and gratitude within our lives, which are pretty good lives, you know? And so one of the things that he said, which I love, is between the stimulus, which is whatever is happening, and your response to that is a choice. And that choice is where the magic is, right? Because you can choose to be grateful. I was just talking to someone today, and I said, your goal in what we're doing here, this is a person I was coaching, is to make every single thing your advantage. Every win's your advantage, every loss is your advantage, everything that bounces your way is an advantage, everything that bounces the other way is an advantage, right? And the only difference between those is your attitude about them. It's going to bounce your way, it's going to bounce the other way. You're going to win, you're going to lose. What you do with that becomes your advantage or not.
Mm.
And when you think about this, how can things going against you be your advantage? Well, think about the biggest growth points you've ever had in your entire life, right? There are things that most of us wish we didn't happen when we're in the moment. And then down the road, we're like, oh my goodness, I'm so grateful that that happened.
True. I have a question about gratitude because I feel like it's so easy to just like blanket statement, like, oh, just be gracious, have gratitude. I think it's this big thing that kind of goes around, which like I get it. But what is it that gratitude actually does within us? Like, why does that work?
So this will sound weird to start, but just stick with me for a minute. Gratitude and curiosity have a lot in common. So what they do for you is they expand your perspective. And think about curiosity as an example. People who are, and by the way, I have to give a shout out to Ted Lasso on this one because he's the one who got me thinking about it. So gratitude. So we're going to put gratitude aside for just a second and talk about curiosity versus what I think is the opposite of curiosity, and that is judgmental, right? Judgment. So when you have judgment, which is a evolutionary default, we need to immediately know, is this person a friend or a foe? Is this dangerous or not dangerous or whatever, right? We need to put things into categories. Well, that's the way it was, eons ago. It's not the way it is now. But when we do that, we shut down everything else. If I decide, Asia, that you are a foe, if you're an enemy or you're dangerous, that's the category that you're in, right? And so now I start to see things that you do to reinforce my belief about you, right? It's called confirmation bias. And so, but on the other hand, if I am curious about what's happening, it opens up the world to me. Like, let me find out more about this person. Why did she just do that? Let me ask her about this, right? These kinds of things. And it doesn't just open it up like conceptually. When you look at the neuroscience that's associated with this, you start to see the arousal levels change, like your central nervous system. If I think you're dangerous, I go into fight or flight. My breathing changes, my muscle tone changes, my focus narrows, etc. Right? My ability to think creatively decreases. I have these spikes of norepinephrine and adrenaline and these kinds of things, stress hormones, cortisol, these types of things. If I'm curious, it's a complete opposite reaction. Oh, that's really interesting. I'm 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 trying to understand. I'm trying to think, oh, this is really, something that might be interesting. And so now all of a sudden I have relaxation hormones and these types of things that are there, right? Okay, so back to gratitude. And by the way, if you walk through life judgmental, you have these spikes of cortisol all day long. You can imagine how exhausting that is, right? And when you are judgmental, you start looking for negative because you're worried all the time. And the more judgmental you are, the more you start looking for negative and you go on that cycle. The more curious you are, the more you look at life and possibilities. So here comes gratitude. Gratitude requires curiosity because for us to be grateful, we have to look at a situation in possibility, right? Okay, so I do this. I preach this because I think it's so important. Red lights. Okay, you're driving, you get to a red light, and most people have some reaction to a red light, and it's not good, right? It's like they get pissed off because they have to stop, or I didn't make that light, something like that. But what if, like Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, you make a choice, and that choice is, hey, you know what a red light's going to be for me? It's going to be a signal to think about something I'm grateful for. Now red lights change for you. The red light doesn't give a shit about you, right? But you get to make a choice about what you're going to do in that moment. And so the point to this is you have to be clever about that, right? You have to be curious about that. What could I do in this situation to turn a negative into a positive? That's where curiosity and gratitude overlap and help each other. The more curious you are, the more you can look for opportunities to be grateful. The more you're grateful, the easier it is to be open-minded and curious about things. They feed each other.
See, and I guess that makes sense too, because if you're walking around stressed all the time, you're going to be in that fight or flight, similar to like if you're walking around in judgment.
Right.
So if you're stressed about things, finding things to be grateful for kind of will help release a little bit of that.
100%.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's so hard if you get yourself down that stress cycle far enough, it's so hard to unwind it. I had a friend that used to do this thing called Ready, Set, Pause, and Amy Martin, and she was like would go a million miles an hour, and her assistant would call her at random times in the day and would say, "Okay, Amy, ready, set, pause," and she would just stop everything for 60 seconds and sort of recalibrate. And I just thought it was such a wonderful thing. And you could do the same thing with gratitude, like have a ready, set gratitude or be grateful. This is one of the reasons why I think something that's like a red light, it's something in our world anyway, right?
Okay.
Make it be something that works for you. Make everything your advantage, right?
Yeah, fair. It's
I
like
want
habit.
to I want to jump back to something for a sec because I think it's an important like distinction. You mentioned judgment, and I think like just thinking about my own self maybe 10 years ago versus today, and you can talk about this a little bit more, Mark. I found, anything that I tried to do to better myself, it was always in relation to where I wanted to be.
Hmm.
So something would happen and I would go, is that the way I want to be when I'm done this journey of bettering myself? And if the answer was no or yes, that already, just doing that exercise on my own is exactly what you're talking about, of being judgmental about, I'm whatever I'm doing today, I'm comparing to some outcome later on versus what you're saying is, if something was really challenging for me today and I had been working on it for a long time and I sort of failed, 10 years ago, I personally would have looked at that and went, I failed because I'm judging myself according to where would have liked this result to be 10 years from now. Yeah, and what you're saying is, hold on a second, let's take a look at that scenario, that event, whatever it is that happened. Is there something we can take from that, and look at this as a positive experience with sort of this lens of gratitude that I can use so that next time I'm there, maybe I can get a little bit closer to where ultimately I would want to go. Is that kind of, what you're saying, Mark?
Yeah, and I would even go further. So about this feedback method, good, better, how. I use this all the time. I love it. If you take that scenario that you just talked about and you say, okay, these things were good, that happened, right? Maybe my preparation was good, maybe my mindset was good, and so forth. But there are things that I can do better. And here's how I'm going to do that. In that situation, you are reaffirming what was good, right? And we know that when we reward something, it's repeated. It's more likely to be repeated, right? This is with children, this is with adults, this is with animals. It doesn't matter, okay? We tend to repeat things that are rewarded for us. So if I say, for example, I was on time for my meetings all week, then I'm likely to be on time for my meetings next week too, because I just rewarded that behavior. Then I'm not saying, okay, so now what? What could I do to get better? I didn't say I did something bad. I said, let's play this game. Let's play the better game, right? Better is a hugely important word because it doesn't say bad, it says elevate, right? Level up. What can you do to get better? Well, I could pay more attention in the meetings. Okay, cool. How do you do that? Let's see. I could read my agenda. I could write notes. There we go. I feel great about it. I had a win this week, and I'm going to have even more wins next week. Right? That's very different than saying, "Hey, I don't think you did a great job at all. You didn't pay attention in the meeting." Like for me, my first response is, "Screw you. You don't know what was going on with me." I mean, I'm not saying that's even a great response, but I would respond much better if you told me, "I really appreciate you being on time for all the meetings this week. Anything you think you could do better?" Now it's a different equation, right? But it's so easy to default to negative. And I'll tell you the other thing about this. You hear this, if I were an elite level performer, that's most of the people that I deal with, the huge majority of people, like the top of the top. And if I heard this, I might think, well, that seems like soft. If somebody isn't doing something good, tell them they aren't doing something good, right? But the fact of the matter is that when you build that kind of a situation, you're creating a trust bond. And now you can get into some deep, heavy feedback because it's coming from a place of trust and responsibility, not punishment.
I like to read about a lot of like high performing CEOs and whoever that is, Warren Buffett, Elon, Jeff Bezos. And I read uh, Jeff talks about this quite a lot, where he tries to make it so that it doesn't matter what your salary is in a meeting. Everyone has the right to share, their thoughts and opinions because he believes that it doesn't matter how much you're getting paid. Everyone has ideas. Everyone has different ideas. Everyone has a different perspective. And we need to create the space where somebody who makes less than the next person next to them doesn't feel like I can't speak in order to, uh, have the best sort of ideas come out of a meeting. And I mean, obviously it seems to work when they look at Amazon. So that would be something that you would work on with some of these people.
Yeah, and one of the questions you had or Asia actually had asked before, but was basically around creating that psychological safety for people so that they can flourish instead of having to worry all the time. One of the ways you can do that is to give people a voice, and when you give people a voice, they feel empowered in what's happening and safe and these kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I think and again, that's something. This question, Aisha, that you asked about where does this start, that people start feeling unsafe or they start feeling, that they need to create some strategy to deal with the world when they're 7 years old. A lot of it, like as simple as this sounds, Aaron, what you just said is a really good example. If you're sitting around the dinner table and your comments as a 6-year-old are not valued, guess what you learn, right? And or if your comments are valued and they're engaged with and so forth, also it's pretty obvious to know what you learn, right? And so being able to create that space is important all the way through life. I mean, for the most part, a friend of mine told me this one time, most internal conflict is coming from because the person either doesn't feel appreciated or they don't feel like they have control. And by control, it doesn't mean controlling the situation. It means they have a voice, right? They can say what they feel like they want to say. And when you think about it, like situations certainly that I've had in employment, as an example, if I didn't feel like I was appreciated and I didn't feel like I had would be allowed to say what I feel like saying, that's a bad situation, right? And so so anyway, I think the Bezos thing is really important. One of the things about Jeff Bezos that I've always been impressed with is he is a learner like crazy. I remember sitting, I'll say I was sitting next to him. It's not like we were on purpose sitting next to each other. We just happened to be at a conference together, South by Southwest in Austin, many, many years ago. And the guy that was speaking was Tony Hsieh from Zappos, and Bezos was taking notes like crazy. I was
As
so
you should.
impressed. Yeah, but I was so impressed, right? That he was a learner, right? So I can see him doing that because he wants to learn from the people at the table.
Okay, I want to circle back here. We've touched on gratitude as one of your like key foundational things to life coaching, personal growth. The other one, or the next one, if you have more, was values. What are values, and why should somebody think about creating a set of values for themselves?
So we just talked about, I just mentioned Tony Hsieh. Tony Hsieh was the CEO of Zappos. I was, uh, and I mean this sincerely, very, very fortunate to work with him very closely. And he really was the one who taught me a lot about values. One of the things that's interesting is he developed corporate values for Zappos, which back in the day was like that was the company to work for. And the thing that was interesting is when you have people align, do you guys see this? I'm not sure what I'm doing.
It's really celebrating this moment.
When you have people align with values, they try to adhere to the values. When you give people a lot of rules, they try to break the rules, right? And so, um,
Is this like a subconscious thing that
yeah,
people don't necessarily consciously think about it? That's just how they behave when those structures are there.
that's exactly right. Rules constrain, values empower,
We
and
should
they
apply
make
this in
you
our
the exact
home.
same thing. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you
For
think about
real.
this. My poor kids had to listen to this stuff all the time. We had family
I
values.
actually wanted you to come on, Mark, so that I could convince her to do a bunch of things. But yeah, keep going.
So, the values are who you are at your core. So, like when I work with people on values, I used to say, okay, what are your core values? Let's talk about these things. What are important? Now I do this process called well, it doesn't matter what it's called. Anyway, I do this process with people and I ask them, hey, tell me moments of joy in your life. And you start to hear things like, oh, when I went to Costa Rica with the boys, and the times that we can be active together, and these kinds of things. And all of a sudden, your values start to come out, right? Physicality, physical fitness, physical freedom is a value. Sharing experiences with loved ones is a value. On, right? And so you don't have to think about it. These are things that are visceral to you, and the values come out. And so then the question is, do you do that enough? Like, do you have those experiences enough? Right? Which I think is one of the things that's wonderful that you guys do. The experiences that you and the boys have had are lifelong experiences, right? And so anyway, the other piece of this and why it's so important is because when you live your life according to your values, and I don't mean 100%, I mean 70, 80%, something like that, man, you are just knocking it out of the park. Like, I'll give you an example. One of my values is choose healthy. And it's a phrase, it's not a word, it's not healthy, right? Because it tells me what to do. It preloads decisions for me. So choose healthy to me means if the waiter says, "Do you want fruit or fries with that?" Choose healthy means, okay, I'll fruit, please. Okay. But it also means if I'm in the office and I walk over to some people having a conversation and they're just gossiping and bad mouthing people, I've got a choice. I either walk away or I change the conversation. And then here's the real secret sauce to this one. if I am having a conversation with myself that's not healthy, I've already answered the question I didn't even ask. Hey, what am I supposed to be doing here, right? Healthy is one of my values. Am I doing that right now? Because if I am not, I need to change. And here's where, and I hope you don't mind me telling this story, but Tony Hsieh was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known in my entire life. He was the one who taught me about values in the first place. And for most of his life that I knew him, he lived his life by values. And so he wasn't just preaching it. And I mean, he was on top of the world. The things he did, like overnight shipping, most people think that's Amazon. That's Tony Hsieh. He was the one who went to FedEx and said, I want to overnight ship everything. And they're like, that's going to cost you a fortune. And he said, if I can tell you how to improve your warehouse system, will you give me a great rate? And they're like, yeah, go for it, dude. And he did. Like, it's amazing. It's an amazing story. Anyway, at the end of his life, he had slipped away from this. And for people who don't know the story, here's this brilliant billionaire who burnt up in a shed in somebody's backyard. Like, it's a crazy tragedy, right? And
Yeah,
so,
it is.
me, values are personal. They're not just something, on a wall or a piece of paper or something. When you live your life by your values, man, life is easy.
I think, like you mentioned, us going away and stuff. I think that like that decision to do that is like whether we actually discussed that or not, like brought out a sheet of paper and said, "Hey, what do we value here? We're making a decision." I think just intuitively we came to the decision to just do it because it actually cost us a lot in other areas. But I think the key is what's the most important area? Like what you're saying is what is the most important area here? And for us, spending time with our family. Our kids are going to be little kids for a very, very short period of time. We've come to understand. Going and exploring the world is another really important uh, value that we have. So just exploration, seeing other cultures, the way people live on this planet. Go and explore. So those two things just basically bulldozed any other reason to not do it. And there's a whole bunch of them. So I think that for us was uh, an example of the values idea. Having this set of values in your mind that you kind of look through and leaf through when you're making any decision. And obviously, it's easier to stick to them on really big decisions. It's a lot easier, such as some smaller ones are a little easier to slip up on and forget, or maybe you might just be taking a break that hour. But that I think is an example recently for us on that travel trip where we just basically said, no, this is what's the most important thing. Everything else will just, that's the way it is, and we're going to solve those problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. So one of the questions that I would have for you guys is, uh, like, to me, one of your values based on, both knowing you and even if I'm just seeing your social presence, right? One of your values is investing in the future, you know, because like you said, Aaron, you had to sacrifice some things, but in the long run, right? Asia, you starting your business, you guys, all the things, Aaron, you going to graduate school, like you going to graduate school, that was a risk, right? You had your, at the time, girlfriend who lived, in a different country. We kept asking Asia to come visit us as often as we could, but you had you know, to, so she had a life there. You were putting that not on hold, but certainly separated. You know, going to another country. I mean, these are things where you're taking a risk and you're separate and you're investing, I think. I mean, is that something that resonates with you?
For sure. For sure. And also too, I think, Aaron, you made a good point. of when you mentioned like, just because you hold these values doesn't mean that there can be consequences by pursuing those values that you know are important to you. The same way that choosing healthy can sometimes mean that you're the odd one out of conversations when people are gossiping. And now they're like, who's this weird man who won't come hang out with us? Right? Like there could be a consequence to having those values and living them out. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, like you said, with the personal growth space, this is about coming your best version of yourself. And by knowing what is true to you, that's all you're really trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And I will say also, again, I applaud you both for this. I think living those values in front of your kids, to me, it helps them. But for, I always found in, when I taught, for example, it would be hard for me to say, this is the way to live your best life and not do that.
Uh-huh.
Right.
I think you pointed out just like going to graduate school and whatnot, and going back to the earlier part of this conversation, like it was pretty uncomfortable at the time, like for both of us. I mean, I'd moved to a different place. It's 3 hour flight from where we live. And I mean, we didn't have money at the time. It's not like we could just be like, oh, whenever you feel like it, well, connect and visit. Like it wasn't like that.
Mhm.
But I actually think going through that time made our relationship 1,000 times, like more fortified, because we went through a pretty challenging thing. And when you come out the other side of it, you both are like, wow, we can pretty much, tackle anything. If we can do that, we can. And also just seeing that event is like, I do look at that event, and I'm very gracious for all the things that happened in my life, and exactly what I'm saying here, like, and what happened in our relationship. There was a really testing point in all of that for the better part of 2 years, and to come out on the other side of it, at the time I wasn't like, yeah, this was great, being from Asia. I mean, sometimes it was great, but a year or two later, you're like, holy smokes, if you can do that, I mean, you can really do a lot of things. I was going to ask you about another point, Mark, something that I've noticed with younger people. Back to the bit of a judgment piece. I'm just trying to bring this up very loosely, but I find that younger people, they like I said, I did. I judged myself on how it went according to how I wanted it to go. What would perfect Aaron have done? What result would he have gotten? And I find oftentimes that those events cut really deep into somebody's self-esteem, and even oftentimes their like own worth, like how they view themselves as a person. It's not like a single event where, as a golf example, like it went in the hole or it didn't gone in the hole. Like they then take it as, I can't do things, I'm not very good at stuff. I'm a terrible person now. Like, do you notice that? And do you notice that amongst different groups of people? And what would you say? Like, how would you advise somebody, or what advice would you give to somebody who experiences that?
I'll tell you one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm actually saying this without judgment. It's just an observation, but parents in successive generations have done more and more for their children, trying to help them. And some have gone overboard to the point that the children have not had an opportunity to fail. And so when they are on their own and they do fail, they don't know how to recover from that. And so to your point, part of that means getting feedback for the first time in their life, maybe, that what they did wasn't perfect and they don't know how to deal with it. Right? They're like, oh my God, all of a sudden I'm not perfect. My whole world comes crashing down because I never built the muscle, the resiliency muscle, to be able to respond to that. It's one of the great things I think about athletics is you're going to fail probably more than you succeed, you know, but you don't think about it that way. You know, even if you have a winning record, I heard this Roger Federer graduation speech one time, and he said, I think he said he won 54% of his points. Arguably if not the greatest, one of the greatest tennis players in the world. But you think about that, if you win 54% of your points, you're winning more than 50% of your points, you're winning the championship, right? But that also means that you're failing 46% of the time, you know? But it didn't bother him. He just kept going, right? And so I think one of the things that I've noticed is that when you give people too much, they don't know how to respond when they don't have that. And it includes, it's not just things, right? It's feedback or these kinds of things. It's participation trophies, you know? And so now all of a sudden you go to work and you didn't get a trophy and this other person did, you don't know how to handle that, you know? And so I think I so the central point here is there is value to adversity. There's value to challenge. There's value to struggle. And in fact, we are built as a species to respond to this positively if it's the right amount of struggle. I'm not talking about full-blown trauma, right? I'm talking about most normal struggles that we have in life. Like there's this sorry, I'll geek out here for a second, but there's a series of researchers in the uh 2000s, early 2000s, that looked at what happens with nerve cells when you put them under medium level stress. And what happens is they grow. If you put them under too much stress, they die. If you put them under too little stress, they die. And so the thing is, there's this optimal amount of stress that we should have in our life. And if you're taking away all the stress, you're crippling the person you're taking it away from. But it's so hard as parents to sit there and let your kids fail.
Not for Aaron.
Well, you know, here's the thing. Aaron grew up as an athlete. He grew up failing, right?
Yeah.
And
I often say exactly what you said, Mark. Like, they're gonna fall down at some point. They might as well fall down while I'm standing here, fall 6 feet off the playground onto the bark mulch while I'm standing here. Then, when they climb 10 feet up and I'm not around and they break their neck because they've never been that high and they have no idea what they're doing. At least, when they climb 6 feet up, I can watch them and they'll learn how to do that over time. And then they'll learn that it hurts if it falls. So they're going to be a bit more cautious. So I have no problem with this.
I kind of think I don't know that this is entirely true, and I'm just making this up, but it may be true. I kind of think it's easier for males to let their kids fail,
Yeah.
you know, and but if you think about that, the female, and I know I'm a huge generalization here, but a lot of times female are more nurturing, more supportive, creating the safe space. And then the male is like, he'll dust it off, right?
Yeah, I do think there's truth to
It'll be
that.
okay.
I do too, for sure.
I also would say, like, for me, I, I view that event, like whatever it is they're doing, that they're about to maybe get hurt or look like an idiot or whatever it is. I actually view that as a positive thing. Like you mentioned investing earlier. Like I view that moment where you might look really dumb right now, or you might get hurt and it's going to suck. But 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whatever it is, you're going to thank me because you will have learned how to do that, whatever it is, physically, athletically, whatever it is, whether, even if it's doing something like this, getting on a camera and speaking to a bunch of people when you're 7, you know, and looking really stupid. You might thank me 10 years down the road when you're like, I'm sure glad I, was able to learn that. And I wasn't so like riddled with fear to do every single thing in life. I could take chances. It's one of the values actually that Asia and I have around our kids is that we want them to do things in the face of fear. If it scares you, we encourage them to do it. Like, okay, Baker, how are you going to do this? Let's figure it out. You're scared. Okay. He says, I'm scared. Well, let's try. I'm here to help you. And I would say 7 times out of 10, he does it, and he doesn't get hurt. And you could just see him afterwards, right? You can just see him like, I can't believe I did that. Like, I am such a strong little boy, or I am whatever it is. I can do everything. So,
Yeah, no, the only thing I would say about that, first of all, I think when parents typically make an error, they make an error in not allowing kids to explore, right? Explore the possibility of failure. And um, there aren't very many parents, they're generally would have some kind of legal consequence if they push them to fail so much that they're neglectful, there's trauma, there's these kinds of things. So there's an optimal state of this, just like there is everything else. But um, letting children know that they're both safe and that they're going to be okay, and those sound like the same thing. They're not. Like, being safe, you can be safe and not have any sense that you're going to be okay because you're so protected. You're afraid to try things because you don't know how it's going to work out. What you two are describing here is a situation where both of the boys feel safe enough to try something because if they fail, they know they're going to be okay, right? Because you guys are there. And I think that that's such a critical combination, right? Creating enough safety, but not too much, and letting them challenge.
so how do you take that concept, Mark, and apply it to a 25-year-old or a 35-year-old?
Well, so, Aaron, this very well, challenge point framework. And Asia, you've had to learn about this too, because we talk about it all the time. The challenge point framework essentially says that if you challenge yourself or are challenged at a certain level, what we call the optimal challenge point, you will learn 3 or 4 times faster than normal. That learning will be stress resistant, which means it holds up under stress, and it scales to the individual. Okay, so I'll just take these apart a little bit. So 3 or 4 times faster. There's been about 3,500 research articles written on this topic over the years, and they've been with rehabilitation, with medicine, with physical learning, with cognitive learning, with robotics, with AI. I mean, all these different things, all these different fields. Older adults, younger adults, people with Parkinson's disease, people who are elite athletes, all different things. And it works over and over and over again. And the idea behind this is that you're creating a certain level of challenge that kicks in the biology of super learning. So we can go deep into this if you want, but the basic idea is that our neural system is set up to respond to challenge, just like we talked about before, just like looking at that single neuron that responds positively to the right amount of stress, right? And the reason it scales to the individual is because my optimal challenge point may not be your optimal challenge point, right? And my optimal challenge point at this time in my life may be different than a year from now or 2 years from now after I practice for a while. And so, fundamentally, um, if I am failing, 35% of the time, 40% of the time during practice, then I'm optimizing learning. But it doesn't look like it. It looks messy. And most people don't like messy. And so they will avoid that level of challenge, and they are avoiding an optimal world, an optimal life, right? Partly because they don't know, partly because it's uncomfortable to fail.
Yeah, I find that a very key point is, and a lot of it's uncomfortable. I mean, a lot of the really good things in life, in my opinion, are uncomfortable. Um, which is why a vast majority of people probably don't partake in it. But okay, I got one last question for you, Mark. You got, you know, somebody who's curious about trying to figure out how to better themselves. They don't really know what to do. What advice would you give that person? You know, if they were to dip their toe into the realm of personal growth, what advice would you leave that person with?
Yeah, it's a really great question because there's so many things I don't know. About who is this person, what are the roadblocks, these kinds of things. But I think probably the first thing would be really trying to understand who, so I'm going to use me as an example, who I am, what I want out of life, and then where my gaps are, right? So let's say that fitness is a really big deal to me. So let's say I'm going to say fitness, okay? Who I am. My identity is a person who believes strongly that fitness is a keystone for all success in life. If I'm exercising on a regular basis, life is good, right? Okay. So, but do I exercise on a regular basis? Let's say no for now. Well, what is it that's holding me back from this one thing that I know is so important? And it could be a lot of different things. I'll give you a really simple example. There was a study that was done one time about exercise adherence, right? How much do you exercise? And they had two groups, and in both groups, um, they removed as many barriers as they could. They asked people to put their exercise clothes right next to the bed. When the alarm went off in the morning, they would get up and get dressed and go out on a walk or run or whatever it is that they would do. And then they'd come back and start their day. One of the groups, though, had a little piece of chocolate that they ate after they exercised. And they found that group adhered to exercise much better than the other group. But here's the really interesting part. The study was over and people were on their own. A year later, they looked and that same chocolate group was still exercising more without the chocolate. And so sometimes it's little bitty manipulations that make a big difference, right? What that was essentially was reward. Most people think about when they're trying to create a habit, for example, there's a stimulus, which was seeing the shoes, and the response, which is going out for a walk, and they forget the reward piece. Because back to what we talked about in the very beginning, when we reward things, they tend to be repeated, and we don't even have to think about it really. So I guess to make it really practical, the very first thing I would say is what's really important in my life to make me feel better as a human being, to make me feel more like me. At my best, what is it that I'm doing? And then am I doing that? And if the answer is no, then what can I do? What one very simple thing can I do to move in that direction? I think that's a really great place to start because so much of it is about starting to move in the direction.
Yeah, I really like that. We're coming up on our time here, Mark. So I just want to say one thing. For me, my, I guess, dipping the toe into this field of personal growth actually occurred when I moved to your house. Um, I had never seen a bookshelf in my life with such interesting topics on it, and I remember picking up a book called "Thanks for the Feedback." I'm not sure if you can still have it, but I looked at your bookshelf and I remember thinking, wow, this is interesting. Like there's a lot of different ideas here and topics here. And I remember grabbing that book and I thought, geez, I spent maybe a couple of weeks or whatever it was reading this book and felt that I had come away with some like tangible skill, and then so then I come back to the bookshelf and there's 200 more books there that I could have dug into. So that's really what has inspired this bookshelf behind me, and it's to be honest, it's what has inspired me to sort of chisel away at the granite around me. So I just wanted to tell you that, and it's one of the reasons why I asked you in the beginning, where did yours kind of start? Because I know where mine started, and it was actually in your house. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thanks for telling me that story. I didn't know that.
And I'm trying to slowly chisel away at our household here. So I think Asia's totally on board now with all this, but we got to get two young guys on the same
Actually, the
Kool-Aid.
first personal development book I ever read was in your house, Mark, and it was The Four Agreements.
Oh, it's one of
And
the best.
it is, and it's so easy to read. Actually, I am going to ask one more because that's obviously a book recommendation, but I'm wondering if you have like a top 3.
Yeah, I will say that the Four Agreements, and I'll tell you what, I mean, it's a beautiful book, but even if you just read the titles of the Four Agreements,
Yeah.
and you do that, holy crap, you've got a huge head start to life, right? You know, so like for example, number 1, be impeccable with your word, right? If you were that, if any of us were that, if we were 70% of that, man, that's a game changer. So
That actually is the one that stuck out to me the most.
Yeah.
I think, and the one that I come back to the most as well.
it is of all of those, it's the most aspirational for me, because it's hard to do, you know. But yeah, when you do it, man, you feel good about yourself, and others do too. So I think that one. I think that the Alchemist is a book that I love.
I haven't read that.
Oh man. So here's the thing about The Alchemist. This message in The Alchemist is so fundamental to who I am as a person. What the Among the many lessons that you get through the book, one of them is that everything that happens is there for you. You may not know it at the time. You may even fight it at the time. But when you look back, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so grateful that that happened. I'm so grateful this didn't work out, or I'm so grateful that door opened, or I'm so grateful I met this person, or, you know, whatever it was. And that to me is, you know, talk about an identity. That is my identity, because there are so many places where I wasn't smart enough to figure out the path, but the path was figured out for me. And I'm just incredibly grateful for that. So that's another one. And I think the third one that I would say is what we've already talked about, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
I just over and over again, I think to myself, if this man could find meaning and grace in Auschwitz, what do I have to complain about? You know?
Very true.
So yeah, I mean, I think those would be my big 3. Thanks for asking, because it was actually kind of fun thinking and thinking out loud about those 3 books. Yeah, I love them, all 3 of them.
I remember at your house, I had read Mindset by Carol Dweck,
Mm-hmm.
and I offered that Asia should read it. She did not accept that offering at the time. I think she probably would accept the offering now, but at the time
Not there.
she
Yeah.
was not interested. So I went, oh, okay, and I went back to the bookshelf. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, we really appreciate your time, and honestly, if I was going to spend an hour with anybody, you are probably the top guy. I miss having these conversations with you daily, but this is the second best. So thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm very, very grateful. I love talking to you guys anyway, so this is really cool.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.